Welcome to part 6 of the lecture on OSGI. After listening to this part, you should be able to declare component lifecycle methods and use properties to make your component configurable. And we will not review the older list 5 ways of configuring components. If that is what is used in your project, you should better read the documentation. Now, some overview. In OSGI, to make a component configurable, the developer defines a certain data structure called metatype. That metatype has two important parts. One, object class definition and designate. Object class definition defines the attributes that determines the configurable properties of the component, and designate binds the object class definition to the component. In a bundle, this data structure exists as an XML document, that is a separate XML document plus entries in the main component configuration XML. In the Java code, this structure is defined using several annotations. Before we get to the code, let's look at the component and the configuration manager consoles. Now, let me switch to the Chrome. This is the component console, and in the component console, if there is a configuration meta type bound to the component, you see a wrench icon next to enable disable icon. So let's find a string generator, a component that we created in the previous part. Here it is. It is not configurable now as we have not defined the configuration for it. So there is no wrench icon here. Let's look at some other component, for example, user configuration. Here, it has a wrench icon, and if you click, it switches us to the configuration manager console and opens an edit dialog. The edit dialog is generated basing on the component object class definition with its attributes. When you save the configuration, the updated values will be available to the component. Now let's go to the code and see how the configuration metatype is configured using annotation. Here is we have stopped at in the previous part. We have the component. We defined a component called the string generator. Let's make it configurable and have it actually generates a string rather than it returns a hard-coded value. We will start with the object class definition, and it's declared as an annotation type. So let's declare it. Annotation type. Now let's annotate with object class definition annotation. That makes an annotation type and OSGI object class definition. Now let's add some properties, and this time let me copy paste the code. So you can see that we added three annotation type elements. Let me explain what they are. The first element returns an array type. Let it be the array of element the string is generated from by the string generator. And by default, those are first 5 words of the lorem ipsum text. The second element returns an integer value that will be the length of the string generated by the method, and by default it is 15. The third element returns a boolean value. It indicated whether the string is truncated if it is longer than the desired number of characters. Then you see that I annotated each element with attribute definition annotation. That annotation makes an element an OSGI attribute definition. You can see that I defined the name, description, and type for each attribute. The name and description are shown in the configuration edit dialog. The type attribute determines the widget that is used to add the field in the edit dialog. A text field or, for example, a checkbox. In most cases, AEM can guess which widgets to use from the element return type. A, a type attribute can be used to override that guess if it is correct. After we created an object class definition, we need to connect the component to it. For that, we go to the component class and add another annotation to it, that is designate. The object class definition is specified as an attribute of that annotation. So let me switch to the IDE and designate annotation and specify the object class definition. That is designate annotation. It is object class definition dot class. To remove this, yep. So we have declared the configuration, bound the component to that configuration. Now one more step remains, that is read the configuration value in the component class. The environment passes the configuration to the component in two cases: when the component is activated or when the configuration is updated. Can attribute change, configuration is deleted, and so on. For the one, needs to do the following. First, add a method to the component that makes an instance of the object class definition as the argument. Add the code that reads the configuration attribute in the methods and, for example, stored the value in the instance variable and then annotate with method activate and modified annotation. Usually, the logic for both the activation and modification is the same. So, the same method can be used. If the logic is different, one can have a separate methods, each annotate with the respective annotation. Now, let's go to the code, and you see I have added some instance variable first. Now, let's fill those variables with values from the configuration. Something like this. Yep. So the method is annotated with the activate and modified annotations and takes the configuration class definition as the argument. Let's also add some generation logic that uses the values of all those fields. Again, let me just paste it. Instead of these hard-coded values, so the generation code is not a deal, but it is enough for the demo. What the code does is it adds a random elements of that parts array to the result string until the length is greater or equal to desired length. Then, if truncate to fit is true, it truncates the string to the desired length and returns. Please note that activate and modified method can take other arguments than the configuration class, such as map or component context, but those are supported for the compatibility with older prior list with these approaches. So now the component is fully configurable. Let's build the project. This is now done. Let's switch to the browser to go to Groovy console. It still contains the code that we pasted in the previous part. So let me run it. So the component generated the string based on the default values defined in the object class definition. You see, this string it consists of the lorem ipsum text. Now let's go to the component console. Let's find the string generated component. Here it is, and now it has the wrench icon. If we open it, an edit dialog opens that contains the default values. Let's change them. Something like this, and save. Now let's go back to the Groovy console and execute the code again. Run the script. Now you can see that a component generates the string based on the new values you have just entered. So that we have just done is reconfigure the component without redeploying the application or restarting the server. Now let's take a look at the XML that is generated from the annotation type and other annotations. So let me switch to the file manager. Here is the bundle jar. Here is the XML that describes the part of the string generator component. Here you can see that elements that have we seen before. Now the plugin added a property element, each of them name and attribute, and provides the default values. Also, the plugin created a separate XML document called the meta type. Let's check. Here it is. It is in the meta type directory and it contains a serialized meta type objects. That meta type includes the object class definition with the attributes, and there is a necessary information to display the edit dialog. And also there is a designate element that binds the object class definition to the component. And let me show to the presentation. So here is the designate element and its PID attribute matches the name of the component, and it contains this OCD ref, attribute object class definition reference, and its value match the ID element of the object class definition. This is how the designate binds the object class definition and the component. To summarize, component configuration can be added in the configuration manager. To make a component configurable, one must declare a meta type. Meta type consists of object class definition and designate elements. Object class definition is declared as annotation type interface with attribute definition. Designate is an annotation in the component class. Attribute values are passed to the component as arguments in activate and modified method. Thank you for your attention. In the next part, we will learn predefined configuration and run modes.